Hollywood's golden age was sold to the public as a flawless dream. Bright lights, red carpets, permanent smiles, and stars elevated into moral icons of their time. But behind the black and white images, there were deaths that never belonged to any script. Real lives were lost in silence, buried under agreements, softened reports, and files that were compromised from the very first day. When a beloved star becomes connected to the death of another person, what determines whether the truth is revealed or quietly erased? If these cases had happened outside the protective bubble of Hollywood power, would justice have followed a different path? Why, in so many of these stories, does the name of the person who died slowly disappear, while the person responsible is reshaped into a legend? And most importantly, how much silence can fame actually buy? This is not a collection of tabloid scandals, nor a simple list of crimes. It is an examination of a system that valued image over accountability, profit over truth, and legacy over human life. In this video, we will revisit 11 figures from Hollywood's golden age whose names became immortal, while the people who lost their lives around them were quietly forgotten. Hollywood has always claimed that justice is blind, but during the golden age, justice often knew exactly who was worth protecting and who was not. William S. Burroughs was not a traditional movie star, yet by 1951, he was already something valuable, a rising cultural figure with money, connections, and a future. In Mexico City, at a party thick with alcohol, he attempted a reckless stunt inspired by the William Tell legend. He placed a glass on his wife Joan Vollmer's head and fired a pistol. He missed the glass. The bullet struck her forehead. She died instantly. Witnesses were present. Burroughs never truly denied pulling the trigger. What followed was not confusion, but containment. He spent just 13 days in jail. His wealthy family moved fast, sending a lawyer with local influence. Bail was posted. Before a real trial could begin, Burroughs left the country and did not return to face full accountability. If an ordinary man had killed his wife in front of witnesses, would he have been allowed to vanish so easily? Or is that kind of escape reserved for people whose names still carried value in the marketplace? Within days, the story began to fade. Police paperwork was thin, investigative urgency evaporated. Joan Vollmer's name slowly disappeared from public conversation, while Burroughs' reputation hardened into a strange, dangerous legend. Years later, he described her death as the event that made him a writer. A woman's violent end became material for a man's creation myth. When did a human life become acceptable fuel for legacy, and why did so many people agree to look away? Paul Kelly's case shows the same logic wearing a different mask. In 1927, Kelly was a Broadway and silent film actor with enough commercial value to be considered salvageable. After an affair ignited a confrontation involving actor Ray Raymond and Raymond's wife Dorothy McKay, Kelly went to Raymond's home. Words turned physical. Kelly beat Raymond severely. Raymond survived the night, but died 2 days later from injuries inflicted in that brawl. Kelly was charged with manslaughter, not murder, a distinction that softened the moral frame from the start. He served roughly 25 months in San Quentin. Then Hollywood made its calculation. Studios welcomed him back. His career resumed and, in time, expanded into notable roles. The dead man's name faded, while Kelly's credits accumulated. Most disturbing of all, Kelly later married Dorothy McKay, the widow of the man who died. So what mattered more, the death itself, or the fact that Kelly could still be sold to audiences? Rex Bell represents the most complete form of disappearance. Bell was a Western actor and, more importantly, the husband of Clara Bow, one of the era's biggest stars. In 1937, multiple historical accounts allege Bell beat a man to death in a Las Vegas hotel after the man made remarks about Bow. Unlike Burroughs or Kelly, this story did not explode in headlines. It barely appeared at all. No courtroom drama, no preserved public file. In some tellings, even the victim's name is lost. This is not damage control after exposure. It is preemptive erasure. Lawyers moved quickly. Local authorities were persuaded to look away.
Witnesses were silenced before their accounts could harden into record. The incident vanished before it could officially exist. If silence is power, this was power at its most refined.
Notice what is missing in all three stories: a sustained public record. Careers continue, credits accumulate, elections are won, while the victim becomes a rumor or a footnote. The system does not need to bribe everyone. It only needs to shape the first narrative that newspapers repeat. Once the frame is set, later facts arrive too late to matter for audiences watching at home. Across these cases, the pattern is unmistakable. The first 48 to 72 hours mattered most. That window decided whether language would be softened, whether reports would be rewritten, whether photographs would be taken or buried. Killing became incident. Recklessness became accident. Witnesses became liabilities, paid, discredited, or quietly removed from the narrative. Families of the dead were often steered towards settlements and non-disclosure agreements, trading public truth for private survival. So ask the uncomfortable question: were these men spared because they were innocent, or because they were valuable? Burroughs, Kelly, and Bell were not treated as ordinary citizens. They were treated as investments. And once a system learns it can erase consequences without resistance, it rarely stops on its own. Hollywood was willing to protect almost anything until violence became impossible to disguise. When blood spilled too publicly, when witnesses were too many and the facts too brutal, the same system that once shielded its stars learned to step back and let them fall. Gig Young was the embodiment of cultivated Hollywood charm. For decades, he played smooth, intelligent men who seemed permanently in control. His career reached its peak in 1970 when he won an Academy Award for They Shoot Horses, Don't They? To the public, Young appeared disciplined and elegant. Privately, he was unraveling. Alcoholism, depression, and growing instability followed him for years, mostly ignored as long as he remained employable. In September 1978, only 3 weeks after marrying his fifth wife, German actress Kim Schmidt, Young crossed a line that could not be softened. In their Manhattan apartment, he shot Schmidt in the head and then turned the gun on himself. There was no ambiguity, no alternative narrative, no missing evidence. The bodies were discovered after concerned friends alerted building security. This was not a case that could be reframed as an accident. The timing alone made it unbearable. A wedding barely concluded, champagne still fresh, and a murder-suicide that ended 2 lives instantly. Colleagues were stunned, but their shock did not turn into defense. Studios issued no protective statements. There were no attempts at rehabilitation. Young's name became inseparable from the act that ended his life. What changed here? Young was no longer a safe investment. His violence was final, undeniable, and impossible to distance from his public image. When a star becomes a liability rather than an asset, Hollywood's loyalty ends quickly. Was this accountability, or simply abandonment once protection no longer served a purpose? Spade Cooley's case is even harder to reconcile. Cooley was not a film star, but a hugely popular Western swing musician and television personality. He was marketed as wholesome entertainment, a smiling bandleader welcomed into American living rooms. Behind that image lived a violent, controlling man whose private life bore no resemblance to his public persona. In 1961, Cooley became convinced his wife Ella Mae Cooley was having an affair. Investigators later found no evidence supporting that belief. What followed was not a momentary loss of control, but hours of sustained brutality. Cooley beat, burned, stomped, and tortured his wife in front of their teenage daughter. Ella Mae suffered more than 40 injuries before she died from massive internal bleeding. Unlike many celebrity cases, this one could not be managed. The violence was too extreme. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony of their daughter was unavoidable. Cooley was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. His entertainment career ended instantly. There were no comeback plans, no softened language, no public rehabilitation. Yet even here, the contradictions remain unsettling. In 1969, Cooley was granted a temporary furlough from prison to perform at a charity concert for law enforcement. He received a standing ovation. Hours later, backstage, he suffered a fatal heart attack. The same man who had murdered his wife was applauded one final time before dying free of his sentence. What does that applause mean? Forgiveness? Denial? Or the public's ability to separate performance from reality, even when the reality is monstrous? Gig Young and Spade Cooley reveal the boundary of Hollywood's tolerance. Protection exists only while image can be controlled. When violence erupts too clearly, when the narrative cannot be rewritten, the system withdraws and leaves destruction behind. These cases were not redeemed because redemption was no longer profitable. So ask yourself, is Hollywood's moral line drawn by ethics or by optics? And if these men had been less visible, less violent, or better contained, would the outcome have been different? Not every case ends with a conviction. In Hollywood, some of the most damaging stories are the ones that sit in the gray space between guilt and innocence. These are the cases where courts reached a conclusion, but public judgment never followed. Where legal outcomes closed files, yet careers, reputations, and entire lives quietly collapsed. Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle was one of the biggest stars of silent cinema. At his peak, he was beloved, wealthy, and powerful, earning sums that made him one of the highest-paid entertainers in the world. In 1921, everything changed. During a Labor Day party at San Francisco's St. Francis Hotel, actress Virginia Rappe became violently ill and died days later from peritonitis caused by a ruptured bladder. What happened in that hotel room has been debated for more than a century. Prosecutors alleged Arbuckle assaulted Rappe, causing her injuries. The defense argued she suffered from pre-existing medical conditions and that Arbuckle was being scapegoated by a sensationalist press. The case went to trial 3 times. The first 2 juries deadlocked. The third acquitted Arbuckle in just minutes, issuing an unusual statement apologizing for the ordeal he had endured. Legally, Arbuckle was cleared. Publicly, he was finished. The press coverage had already done its work. Newspapers published lurid claims that were never supported by medical evidence. Moral outrage spread faster than facts. The film industry, fearing regulation and backlash, needed a sacrifice. Arbuckle became it. The studios distanced themselves. Theaters refused to show his films. His contracts evaporated. So what mattered more, the verdict or the headlines that came first? If innocence could not save him, what exactly was the trial for? Arbuckle eventually worked again behind the camera under a pseudonym, directing films without his face attached. When he attempted a modest return to acting years later, his heart gave out. He died at 46, never recovering the life he had before Virginia Rappe's death. He was legally innocent, yet permanently condemned. His case established a brutal truth. In Hollywood, acquittal does not equal forgiveness. Decades later, Robert Blake would experience a modern version of the same phenomenon. Blake's career spanned generations. From child actor to Emmy-winning television star on Baretta, he was a recognizable figure long before his name became synonymous with scandal. In 2001, Blake's wife, Bonnie Lee Backley, was shot to death while sitting in a car outside a restaurant. Blake claimed he had left her alone briefly and returned to find her dead. The investigation was relentless. Blake was arrested and charged with murder. Prosecutors argued he either pulled the trigger himself or hired someone to do it. His defense highlighted the lack of physical evidence and pointed to Backley's history of conning wealthy men. The criminal jury acquitted Blake, citing reasonable doubt. But the story did not end there. In civil court, where the burden of proof is lower, Blake was found liable for Backley's death. He was ordered to pay millions in damages, a judgment that effectively bankrupted him. Though he was legally free, his career was over. No studio would touch him, no comeback was offered. Acquittal saved him from prison, but not from exile. What does justice mean when 2 courts deliver opposite outcomes, and which verdict truly defines a person's fate? Then there is Charles Chaplin Jr., a case far less famous, but equally revealing. As the son of Charlie Chaplin,
His name carried inherited power, even though his own career never approached his father's stature. In the 1960s, Chaplin Jr. was involved in a drunk driving accident that resulted in a fatality. Details remain inconsistent, and records are sparse.
What stands out is not the accident itself, but its aftermath. Charges were minimized, consequences were limited. The incident never became part of his public identity. His famous surname absorbed the damage. While others lost everything under suspicion alone, Chaplin Jr. moved forward with relative obscurity rather than disgrace.
Why was one man erased for being acquitted, while another was protected despite causing a death? The difference was not morality, it was risk. Arbuckle became dangerous to the industry's image. Blake became unmarketable. Chaplin Jr., quietly shielded by legacy, never threatened the machine.
These cases reveal Hollywood's most uncomfortable truth. Justice is not the end of the story. Perception is. Courts may decide guilt, but industries decide relevance. Some people are destroyed, even when cleared. Others are spared because the cost of scrutiny is deemed too high. So ask yourself, when the law speaks, who is listening? And when it falls silent, who decides what history remembers? Not every killing in Hollywood history came from rage, greed, or ambition. Some came from fear. Some came from desperation. And some came from a child who believed there was no other way out. Cheryl Crane was only 14 years old when her life was permanently divided into before and after. She was the daughter of Lana Turner, one of MGM's most glamorous and bankable stars. To the public, Turner embodied elegance and strength. Privately, her relationship with gangster Johnny Stompanato was violent, controlling, and increasingly dangerous. On the night of April 4, 1958, that danger reached its breaking point. Stompanato was in Turner's Beverly Hills home, enraged and threatening. Witnesses later described a pattern of abuse that had already included beatings and intimidation. During a heated argument, Stompanato reportedly threatened to destroy Turner's face and end her career. For a woman whose livelihood depended on her image, it was not an idle threat. From another room, Cheryl Crane heard the shouting. She heard the threats. And in that moment, she believed her mother was about to be killed. Crane took a kitchen knife and entered the bedroom. She stabbed Stompanato once in the abdomen. He bled to death before help could arrive. Legally, the case was clear. After investigation and inquest, authorities ruled the killing justifiable homicide. Cheryl Crane had acted in defense of her mother. No criminal charges were filed. On paper, the system worked. But paper does not measure trauma. At 14, Crane became known worldwide as the girl who killed her mother's lover. The media swarmed, rumors spread, alternative theories were whispered, including claims that Turner herself had wielded the knife and that her daughter was protecting her. The truth mattered less than the spectacle. Hollywood moved quickly to protect Turner's image, shaping the narrative into one of maternal devotion and tragic necessity. For Cheryl Crane, there was no such protection.
In the years that followed, she struggled deeply. She battled depression, substance abuse, and repeated suicide attempts. She was sent to psychiatric facilities and reform schools. The ruling of self-defense closed the legal case, but it did nothing to close the psychological wound. She had taken a life, even if the law said she was right to do so.
What sentence does a child receive when the court says she is innocent, but her mind refuses to agree? Unlike many others in this series, Crane did not benefit from silence. Her story never disappeared. It followed her into adulthood, shaping how she was seen and how she saw herself. She later wrote about the experience, describing the long shadow cast by that single moment. Survival did not bring freedom. It brought endurance. Cheryl Crane's case forces a distinction Hollywood rarely acknowledges. There is a difference between legal innocence and emotional release, between justification and healing, between being cleared and being whole. The system may declare a case closed, but for those who live with the consequences, closure is not guaranteed. Crane did not escape punishment. It simply took a different form, one carried quietly for the rest of her life.
So, ask the hardest question of all. When self-defense saves a life but destroys another, who decides what freedom actually means?
For decades, Hollywood relied on distance and silence to protect its own. But Johnny Lewis belonged to a different era, one where bloodline alone was no longer enough to rewrite reality. Lewis was not a Golden Age star himself. His connection to Hollywood royalty came through birth. He was the grandson of Loretta Young, an actress whose carefully managed image represented the moral polish of classic Hollywood. That lineage carried expectations, access, and a certain inherited protection, but it did not carry immunity. Lewis built a modest acting career, appearing in television series such as Sons of Anarchy. Yet behind the scenes, his life was unraveling. Arrests, erratic behavior, and public signs of instability began to accumulate. Friends and observers noticed something was wrong. His struggles with mental health were evident, but treatment was inconsistent, and intervention came too late. In 2012, the situation reached a violent and irreversible conclusion. Lewis attacked and killed his elderly landlady, 81-year-old Catherine Davis, inside her home. The assault was brutal, involving strangulation and blunt force trauma. Afterward, Lewis attacked two neighbors who attempted to help. Moments later, he fell, or jumped, from the roof of the building to his death. There was no cover-up. There was no narrative management. The facts were immediate, public, and unavoidable. Toxicology reports showed no drugs in his system. Investigators pointed instead to untreated mental illness, possibly exacerbated by a previous motorcycle accident that caused head trauma. The story was reported plainly. No softened language, no heroic framing, no silence. This is where the contrast with earlier cases becomes stark. If Johnny Lewis had lived during Hollywood's golden age, would this story have reached the public in the same form? Would the police reports have been softened? Would witnesses have been discredited? Would the death of an elderly woman have quietly disappeared behind a more convenient explanation? By the time Lewis died, Hollywood's old machinery no longer functioned as it once had. The centralized studio system was gone. Independent media, digital reporting, and public access to information made erasure difficult. Legacy could open doors, but it could not close them fast enough. Lewis's bloodline did not save him. It did not save his victim, and it did not protect the story from being told. His case exposes something fundamental. Hollywood's power was never absolute. It depended on control, of information, of access, of timing. Once that control weakened, the system could no longer contain violence within acceptable boundaries. The truth did not surface because the system became moral. It surfaced because it lost the ability to suppress. Johnny Lewis's story is not one of redemption or scandal. It is a collapse, a collision between inherited privilege and modern accountability. A reminder that even the most carefully curated legacies cannot shield untreated illness, nor can they erase consequences once the mechanisms of silence fail. So, ask the final question. When Hollywood could no longer decide what we were allowed to know, did justice finally appear? Or did the truth simply arrive too late to save anyone? These 11 stories are not connected by genre, talent, or even guilt in the legal sense. They are connected by something far more unsettling. Every case began with a real human death, and every outcome was shaped by power rather than equality. Not all of the people you've heard about were convicted killers. Some were acquitted. Some acted in self-defense. Some were never charged at all. But in every story, a life was lost while a system decided what could be seen, what could be softened, and what could be erased entirely. Hollywood did not invent violence. It perfected the art of surviving it. What emerges is not a list of criminals, but a pattern. A pattern where value determined protection, where silence followed money, and where history itself was edited to preserve careers while victims faded into obscurity. The Golden Age is often remembered for its glamour, but it was also an era where image routinely outweighed accountability. Now the question turns to us. Do these stories change how we see classic Hollywood? Do they force us to reconsider the difference between legal innocence and moral responsibility? And how should history judge a system that allowed fame to function as a shield? We want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment with your perspective, your questions, or your disagreements. These stories are not closed cases. They are conversations Hollywood never wanted us to have. And perhaps the most important question remains. When the lights fade and the myths collapse, whose lives do we finally choose to remember?